So good morning, General Director Stephen van Hoogstraten.
Yeah.
It was really an honor that we could begin today with your keynote address. I thought it was really symbolic, but also very insightful to begin the day really with those perspectives. We'd love now to deepen some of the thoughts that we had a chance to benefit from in your lecture, just asking a few follow-up questions. First of all, the Peace Palace has been host to the International Court of Justice and the Permanent Court of Arbitration for many years. Surrounded by an environment of human rights and law, what recommendations would you give for strengthening the capacity for international law to encourage the universal adoption of human rights?
Well, in my view, clearly the way forward for human rights is a further codifying and further implementation within the states. This Peace Palace is an international institution that radiates respect for the rule of law, and the two institutions that you mentioned are involved in that and was seen at the time as the answer to international conflict, namely to have arbitrations and settle the matter peacefully. Human rights clearly is a bit different field of action because it goes right into the heart of the states, and that makes the issue of human rights so incredibly difficult, and that's what I try to explain in my talk as well. So the way forward is, I think, continue the monitoring by the Council on Human Rights in Geneva, so have a clear picture of what is happening. That can be the Council on Human Rights, it can also be human rights, but at least NGOs that show you what is happening, so that what is against the human rights comes to the surface and would then lead to remedial action.
Okay, excellent. Carnegie Foundation is the founding partner of the Hague Institute for Global Justice. Can you tell us a little bit more about this? And in your opinion, what are the most pressing issues surrounding global justice at this time?
Yeah, well, that is true. The Institute for Global Justice was founded in The Hague as the result of an initiative of 8 plus or minus academic institutions, of which we are part. A University of Leiden is part of it, Asser Institute is part of it, and so on, and a few others. The idea of global justice was that it was a multifaceted or multidisciplinary cooperation between themes like security and law and governance or development cooperation. So it was not just a one theme organization, but it would be a multifaceted approach to the difficult issues of today. So if you say, well, what are the main themes of global justice? I think conflict prevention is always one of them, because you think in preventing conflict you prevent injustice. Remedial action is also a big one. We call that in the institute where I'm a member of the board. That's very much the rule of law program. I myself think that what I mentioned in my speech, that the fight against corruption in the world is an important aspect of fighting injustice. And the problem always is that if two states, or many states, are in conflict, then justice is the first victim. And so you would like to stay away, at least calm down and get the conflict resolved and then build on justice. I think transitional justice is an important notion there, because some countries have simply no infrastructure left and others are halfway back on track. I think we should very much support those countries, and that also is an aspect of global justice, in my view. Help countries that have a justice system in the making and see that it becomes more solid.
Okay. You already partially answered this question also in your references to corruption, but from your work experience in the political but also international environments, what would you say is the greatest barrier, or what are the greatest barriers to ensure international cooperation and to achieve universal adherence to international law?
To ensure universal adherence to international law. Yeah. And it is clearly I think it's only one thing. It's the part of my speech which I left out because I thought I was running over time. The world system is based on a notion of sovereign nations. Every nation in the world system is equal to each other, whether you are big or whether you are small. We're all part of a system of sovereign nations. They can make their sovereign decisions, whether to adhere to international law or not, or to say that they adhere to international law and then not do it. I think if you ask for a stumbling block, it's clearly the fact that governments can do what they think is right for them. If you take the International Criminal Court, that is adhered to by 120 countries and not by 190 countries, that is because the other countries, the missing ones, feel it is in their interest not to be a part of the criminal court. The court here, the International Court of Justice, works for those states that accept the jurisdiction of the court. It is an organ of the United Nations, and still it only works for those nations that have accepted its jurisdiction. Several important players in the world have not done that because they feel threatened by the idea that a third party could watch over their interest, could decide over their interest. A well-known example is, of course, the United States, but another well-known example is China. China will never accept that a conflict between that country and another country would be settled by a third party. It is not in their system. So I think that is where, if you ask me this question, this is where I would put the finger.
Okay. So that's, I guess, the main barrier or challenge in that sense. In terms of solutions, I'd be curious to get your perspectives on maybe cultural diplomacy and civil society. So first of all, cultural diplomacy, what does that mean for you, or how would you define cultural diplomacy? And secondly, you could look at the Carnegie Foundation, perhaps even as an example in some ways of cultural diplomacy, and also an example, let's say, where civil society is also getting involved. It's not just the courts or the legal measures. So to summarize, what is cultural diplomacy, and what role do you see for cultural diplomacy and or civil society to promote human rights and also to protect them?
I would have to think on what I exactly would cover by the notion of cultural diplomacy. I think cultural diplomacy is different from normal diplomacy because it is active in the field of culture and cultural exchange. And I think that in itself is an extremely positive development because it brings nations closer to each other. Recently we had here in The Hague the Orchestra for Peace, which comes from the Middle East and which is composed of musicians from Israel and from Egypt and from Jordan and other countries. So that was a rather big event here in the Peace Palace and then in the church. And that, to my feeling, brings people closer to each other. To say that it has a special sort of strategic role to play, I would find difficult. I would need more time to think about that. What I do think is, when you say you have the courts and you have the civil society, I very much am with you there. You see, the courts are there to solve issues. Basically, at the end of the line, there is a conflict, and at a given point in time, the countries decide that they want an outside judgment or an outside arbitration. That means that they are both ready to win the case, but they're also ready to lose the case. They see the solution by a third party as a way out. And often, many cases do not come here because the governments involved feel that it is not yet time for that, or that they might lose something that they now have in their hand. Now, it's talking about the civil society and culture do not easily access this building, so we have to look at other parts of, of the activities of a diplomatic nature. Civil society, of course, includes the NGOs. I mentioned the Human Rights Watch. I think they have a major role to play because they can say things that normally governments would not say. And whether it is Greenpeace or this Human Rights Watch or any other, interest organization that can bring out the wrongdoings by governments, I think they are very, very positive factors in the international debate. They are not let in the court system here because I think the UN has never accepted anyone else than states to talk to each other. But to have the views in these difficult matters of monitoring institutions that are composed of private initiatives, I can only say that very much appeals to my views. I'm sorry I couldn't give you a good answer on cultural diplomacy, but I find it difficult to venture.
No, it's good. From our point of view, cultural diplomacy is really how does one build understanding and trust between cultures and also countries. So I think culture is one component, but not necessarily the only. And I think there you made the example of the orchestras for peace.
I also, yeah.
Which is very powerful. There's Daniel Barenboim, you may be familiar with as well. I think what's great there is they can really demonstrate. And I think what's important is something like that, it can give hope to show that it is possible to play in the same orchestra, to play on the same side.
Certainly.
However, I think beyond that, where I was really trying to get at is in terms of whose responsibility is human rights. Is it enough to say, okay, that's the job of the UN and the courts, or does civil society also have a responsibility as well as a potential to also engage, whether it's raising awareness such as Human Rights Watch or others. And that would be fascinating if you could maybe just as a final question, how do you see the responsibility being shared for human rights between civil society, public sector, private sector? And what potential, where do you think civil society can really have an impact when it comes to international law and human rights?
Well, I think the impact is primarily, I would say, in exposing certain situations and then follow the government or incite the government to do something as a second step. I didn't mention, but I'll send you my text so you read that. That human rights is very much a big thing in this country. There is a special ambassador for human rights. The government is always, say, on the go for human rights. Bilateral relations are affected or they are dominated by matters of human rights. So I would say that the citizen actions, initiatives, plus the media is a very powerful, I think, the only motor that makes the human rights situation work. Of course, the other motor is the protection here in Europe of the European Convention on Human Rights. But that is an overloaded system, and you always have to wait for the decision of a judge. The live scene on human rights is a live scene which is made by the media, and I think it's the media that expose and it's the media that call on governments for action just by asking them what are you going to do about it.
True. Well, Mr. van Hoogstraten, thank you very much for your perspectives and the exchange. We look forward to continuing the collaboration with you and also with Carnegie, and we very much appreciate your time. So,
thank you.
Thank you very
much. Lots of success. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you very much.